If you could reinvent your organization and your career, what would you do? After many years of working with executives from prominent organizations, Tim Leberecht recognized and wanted to support people's desire to feel a sense of belonging, dream bigger, stretch their wings, and transform how they lived and worked. After publishing his first book, The Business Romantic, Tim took the leap to reinvent his life and career. He co-founded the House of Beautiful Business, a unique company that helps humanize organizations and build a more beautiful future. Today, Tim is sought out by leaders of Fortune 500 companies and organizations across sectors who are seeking to develop a new playbook to align their work with a deeper sense of purpose and human connection. In this conversation, Tim and I discuss the work he does through the House of Beautiful Business, how his time as a musician and recording artist influences his work today, lessons learned as a C-suite executive, how to create beauty in business, the importance of cultivating imagination and conviction, and how the future of business might be outside of business. Let's dive in. Tim, welcome to Making Business Art. Thank you so much for making time to be on here today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Tim. So you have a really interesting career, and I'm very curious to hear about the various things that you have to share. But the first thing I'm curious to hear about, given what you do now, we go all the way back when you were a child. What did you want to be when you grew up?
To be exactly what I am now, funny enough. But it's taken me about 50 years to get there, with a lot of digressions, a lot of detours, a lot of errors and mistakes along the way. But I think maybe when I was 10 or 12, I founded my own fictitious publishing company. I owned my own football team. I produced my own concerts and conferences. So I always wanted to be a curator, a creator, a convener, a publisher, someone who collects ideas and people who have ideas and present them to the world. And I wanted to have my own media empire when I was 12, 14, and I remember that I published newsletters and magazines, all fictitious stuff, and shared it with friends and my parents. I ran little shows and performances for like talk shows in a sense for my parents, very much to their chagrin, they had to sort of sit through hours of nonsensical guitar playing and pseudo interviews and stuff like that. And in many ways, I mean, I really was into play. I was a very playful child and even teenager, and that's exactly what I do right now with the House of Beautiful Business. And my work is actually just to create a playground that is now in business, or pretends to be in the context of business, but it's still predominantly a playground. So I'm very happy that I returned to my childhood inclinations and dreams. It just has led me through a corporate career that I had to live through, and then at the same time also transcend to arrive back at my original desires.
Yeah. So do you feel that original spirit from back then that's still very much alive in what you're doing now, or is it different?
It's still very much alive.
That's
I feel
wonderful.
like I'm 52 now, but I feel very much, maybe even more so than I did 10 years ago. I feel like the inner child and the boy in me, and the young child and the playful child, and the decisions that I make, for what it's worth, are also still very, or maybe again, very intuitive and very emotional and very much sort of rooted in what I want and crave, and rather than a preconceived notion of rationality or sort of conventions that I'm trying to live up to. I mean, not that I do, of course, and I'm also conforming with expectations and conventions. I'm not saying like I'm free as a bird and I'm doing my rebellious thing. Of course I'm not. But I feel very much in tune with, what I always wanted to do and what I believe I can bring to the world. It's not so grandiose, but yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, I don't recall ever hearing somebody say that they actually grow up to express, to be really that connected with that form of expression. And just to share myself, I'm working on that, on looking at that kind of unconditioned type of expression that was arising naturally for me when I was a kid, and just examining where the conditioning is and just working at cleaning that away, just to leave that essence alive to be expressed now. So anyway, so thank you for modeling that for me and possibly for many other people. That's excellent. So let's jump into the present day. You have this company. So tell me about where do you work and what type of help do clients seek from you?
The present company is the House of Beautiful Business, which I co-founded in 2017 with my longtime colleague and very close friend Till. He lives in Munich. At the time when we founded it, I lived in Berlin. I was born and raised in Germany and spent my first 30 years there before moving to Los Angeles for grad school and then staying in the US for another 13 or 14 years in Silicon Valley. Now I'm back in mostly in Europe. And that's also where the majority of the team is. We're a really small team. 12 people right now, some freelancers that we hire for bigger projects and productions. The team is distributed. There's an office in Berlin. There's, I think, 5 people right now in Berlin, and then others are distributed really around the world, from Toronto to Barcelona to London to Munich to whatnot. And yeah, we call ourselves the network for the life-centered economy. So we believe that the world is witnessing this big paradigm shift where business as usual is broken. Some of the externalities have become so profound that I think you will be hard pressed to find a single business person who believes that business can continue the way it is run right now. So everybody's looking for alternative ways of growth or ungrowth, degrowth, value creation, meaning through business. And when I wrote my first book, which came out in 2015, The Business Romantic, the idea was to bring the community that the book had spawned together in the form of a really romantic, beautiful business conference that is unlike any other business meeting the world had ever seen. So no business cards, no transactional nature of things, no name badges, really a gathering that is all about attachment and intimacy and really deep, meaningful conversations and connections. Theatrical at times, drawing from the arts and communities, a very artistic, like an album that musicians would make and present to the world, but catering to business people predominantly. And that's what we then did in 2017. That was the birth hour of the House of Beautiful Business. We did it in Barcelona in an old Gothic quarter in an old guild hall. It was very operatic in a sense. And then it's grown and it's now become this community of people worldwide. We have more than 50,000 professionals who follow us, who receive our content, who take part in our events and smaller events all around the world, but then also in our big annual gathering that we hold once a year. The last time we did it was in Tangier in Morocco. Before that, we did it in Lisbon in Portugal. That's bringing the core members of our community together. We produce research as well. We do consulting work with many Fortune 500 companies. We help them curate. That's maybe our superpower, that we identify interesting people and ideas, just as I did, or I was faking to do when I was a child, and package them in a way that is immersive and emotive and interesting and transformative for participants. And all of that through the lens of the life-centered economy. So an economy that is more like life, that makes us come alive, that honors all forms of life, that is not just about the humans at the center, but really life in its myriad shapes and forms. There's a whimsical, sentimental nature to what we're doing that is closer to art and philosophy than it is to the brute force of a very mechanistic, efficiency-driven productivity machine that business has become in sort of the post-industrial, digitalized era. And so I think people come to us and see in us a beacon of hope that another business world is possible. And when they join us, when they take part in our gatherings, or they join us online for sessions, or they take part in our research, or they work with us as consultants, I think that's what they want. They want a different sentiment. They want a different perspective on business, and they want help as to how they can embody it and live up to it and tell the story of it. So we bring the language, the rituals, the practices, the experiences there into these organizations and to these people. And I think that's giving us the mandate and the license to play and to, as much as we can, live up to the promise that is inherent in our name, the House of Beautiful Business.
Mm-hmm. So, do you have an example of a time when, like, how does beauty show up in the business world?
It rarely does. That's the whole point. That's why we made it our mission
Mm-hmm.
to and wrote it on made it our anthem, if you will. It does show up. I mean, having worked with many companies and many leaders, and from listening to the stories that they share at our gatherings, it shows up in the small moments. So it shows up in the hallways. It shows up when people make decisions that are maybe more in tune with their intuition or sentiment, or that are empathetic. It shows up when people show vulnerability. It shows up when they're in a state of flow and they're part of a project that is so exhilarating and so beautiful in terms of how they collaborate together. That is a peak experience that they will never forget. It shows up when people grieve together over the end of a project, the end of a relationship, the end of employment, or physical death of a colleague or a friend. It shows up in these very human moments when people are very much with themselves and their human nature, but also feel like they're part of something that is greater than themselves. But that being said, there's also, I mean, there's some companies that whose mission maybe is a little bit more conducive to this notion of beauty, because their ambition is to make the world more beautiful, as in more inclusive, more sustainable. But I think the challenge is always to make the purpose of a company, and this is this much abused buzzword right now, make the mission of a company match the moments, the small moments of attachment and intimacy that I was trying to describe. If they match, right, for the most part, they're not always going to be fully congruent, but if they match largely, more or less, I think then we know from a lot of research that the employees, the workers of that company, and also the consumers or the clients of an organization feel like they're at home, and they belong, and they can trust that organization. I think that's the business benefit of beauty, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's not cosmetics, right? It's not making everything look good or look pretty. It's really a understanding of business that is in harmony with human needs, with environmental needs, with spiritual, somatic needs that we have that we've long neglected, a much more holistic notion of business. That is beautiful. So you could also say, I always quote the Portuguese writer Fernando Pessoa, beauty is what does not exist. And in business, I would say beauty is what we want more of, but what doesn't exist yet enough. That's the gap we're trying to fill.
Mm. So let's just talk more about life-centered economy. Is there somebody out there that's at least making a good attempt at it, or somebody that you want to call out that's really trying, or some example in some way?
Life-centered economy, I mean, there's just, first of all, let me just talk a little bit about the definition, and then I can give some examples of people who I
Mm-hmm.
think are good role models or good ambassadors of it. I mean, it's been around for decades. It's nothing that we invented. It's been around at least since the early days of the Club of Rome and their seminal publication, The Limits of Growth. I mean, the rallying cry for an economy that is not just extractive and not only serving human needs at the expense of other life on Earth and other species is old. And of course, in a way, it goes back to the Greek economy and the idea of an economy as a shared household that is respectful of all constituents and of all life, and not just extracting value for a slight socioeconomic strata, predominantly of society as it is now. But I think there's various shades to various definitions of life-centered, right? And the term is also now being used by big conglomerates such as Accenture and others. For some of them, it's just simply a synonymous term for sustainability, right? It's an economy that is ecological, that respects planetary boundaries. And that is true for our definition of life-centered as well. But ours is maybe a bit more radical, such as that we believe it is also about all the life that is inside us. So it's an invitation to express all of the full scope of life and being alive that we humans bring to the table, that so often is not allowed or is taboo at the workplace. And it also means to explore a level of or explore life as it presents itself to various forms of intelligence, right? So it's the intelligence of nature, it's merging biology with technology and this new form of life, potentially new hybrid forms of life that emerge from that. And it is also what we still nostalgically call artificial intelligence, right? Which ultimately I believe will present a new form of consciousness, a new form of being. Who are we to judge as to whether that is life or not? It is a new form of, as the, I think it's the CEO of Microsoft AI calls it, a new digital species. So we understand life-centered economy also as an economy that combines all of these forms of being, including AI. That's really the fascinating opportunity right now. So who is doing that? I mean, if you look at more ecological, self-sufficient, autonomous, regenerative aspects of the life-centered economy, then there are people like John Fullerton, a former banker, now converted regenerative economist with his Capital Institute. He just spoke at one of our events in Tangier, who's really been a spokesperson for the movement. He pointed me to these cooperatives, for example, that exist in the Basque region of Spain, that do business at a very different scale and very self-sufficient, with the goal to basically have the community's goodwill at the core of what they do and not being extractive. I mean, a really, from start to finish, regenerative idea to doing business. There are many other circular economy models or parts of circular economy models that are now being adopted by design firms, by product development firms, by manufacturers. There's, of course, sort of the big companies such as Patagonia that have it written all over their philosophy and genuinely really mean it and make their business match their ambition. So there's a lot of responsible commerce, regenerative leadership. The Bio-Leadership Institute, for example, around Andres Roberts, a collective of people who are seeking to emulate the principles of biology and bring them more to how we run businesses and how we manage our own emotional, cognitive, intellectual, spiritual households as leaders. So there's many attempts underway, and I'm really seeing of efforts right now, particularly on the regeneration front, that I think will make or are making the life-centered economy a reality. But it's not a revolution that's happening overnight. I think it's a slow and grinding process to many gatherings and many projects and many pioneering efforts that is slowly but surely, I believe, replacing an outdated model of doing business that is harmful to us and to all life around us.
Yeah. Just to springboard off this topic, it was just making me think of when the pandemic first rolled in to Europe, the US, etc. And I was amazed at how quickly businesses reacted, pivoted. Some businesses really were running out of oxygen within a couple of months. And there were some, I don't know how accurate this was, but some changes in the environment of water being cleaner and some like kind of animals showing up in some areas very quickly. And it really struck me at how fast things can change if enough people change their behavior. And I mean, in this case, it was kind of forced by this plague, but in other ways, if enough people could be persuaded to think and act differently, it can really bring about change very quickly. I wonder if you had any type of observation like that during the pandemic, or if you took any lessons learned of that time when we were in lockdown and kind of things had to shift very fast.
It was a really important time, and I remember it almost with a bit of regret and a certain tenderness. A lot of people were suffering and you had to fight for their jobs, lost their jobs, and of course their health, their existence. So I don't want to belittle that at all. But I think it was also a time of opportunity where different connections were made. I mean, it shook us at the core, our understanding of civilization, who we are as a species. Krista Tippett, the On Being podcast host, called it a species moment, right? It was a moment at which we were all awakening to the potential, to the pitfalls of how we had run this planet and how we had run our lives. And there was maybe during the early wave of the pandemic, there was a window of 4, 6, 8 weeks where with the House of Beautiful Business, we ran a lot of online sessions for free and brought together a community internationally. And it felt like such a precious moment where we were allowed to ask bigger questions, higher purpose questions, where we looked at ourselves in the mirror, where we looked at each other on Zoom with much more love and care and tenderness than before. And then I think some of that probably is still an undercurrent of what we're doing right now, and it will not go away. I think there's a remembrance there that's now built into any of our new efforts that's still shaping them. But at the same time, I think at the end or in the middle of the pandemic, there was also a desire just to go back to basics. So it was this fork in the road moment where then businesses and society also said, okay, that's all great, but now that we are at the end of this or we're near to overcoming it, let's first make sure we go back to the basics, right? And basically go back to, there was a desire to go back to things as usual as well, which was was so lamentable. And I think it really was a moment where we realized, I'm quoting the Nigerian philosopher Bayo Akomolafe here, who has been our philosopher in residence, who said, we realized that everything is between the two of us, but also there's nothing between the two of us. We're so intimately connected through this contagious virus. We realize how connected we are. But also, in a sense, everything is between the two of us, as in there are microbes, right? There's all these sort of there's all this micro life, right, that we have failed to acknowledge. Like, we're just part of this tapestry of life. And in a way, there are no subjects, it's all matter, it's all this micro matter that's between us. And I think that's also what we've come to realize. And so it was a humiliating, at least a humbling moment for us that we should have made much more of. At the same time, you mentioned the changes that occurred because consumption habits changed, right? The ecological footprint of plane, the emissions went down significantly. I remember seeing these maps, right, before and after, and suddenly like the air was cleaner and so forth. And that's all true, but at the same time, from what I know, what I've heard from experts who know this space much better than I do, is all the consumption changes they're a small dent in the whole universe of reversing climate change. I think the problem is, of course, are the deep structural, the structural scaffolding that we created. Like, it's all these projects, right? The oil drilling and fossil fuels and that are planned for decades out now. It's all that money that's already been invested, more money being invested into these types of projects. Then also, of course, the carbon footprint of digitalization that's often not being talked about, right? The materials needed, the minerals needed for enabling our digital economy. So I think there's very big structural, infrastructural challenges to be solved that would actually really make a difference, rather than changing our behavior, which we saw during the pandemic. So a lot of lessons to be learned. I don't think we heeded all of them, unfortunately, but there's a certain sentiment and an openness and a vulnerability that I think are living on, and that hopefully will inform some of these new models of doing business going forward.
Yeah. So now I'd like to turn to the festival that lives on, the House of Beautiful Business Festival that you kept doing since 2017. Yeah, and I do have to acknowledge that you do somehow curate this amazing group of people on there. And sometimes when I think about, in the last couple of months, when I think about like, oh, where do I find the next really interesting guest for this project? I think I'm just going to go find your blog to find the people there. So you just hosted this. We're recording in May of 2024, and you just hosted this like a couple of weeks back. What are a couple or a handful of top highlights for you from the festival?
We just hosted, it was the 8th annual gathering of the House of Beautiful Business. We did 2 in the first year in 2017, hence the 8th edition of it. And we went for the first time on African soil. So we hosted it in Tangier, Morocco. We had done it in Lisbon for many years, ever since our first one in Barcelona. So it was I think it felt like fresh paint for us, although notoriously, I say notoriously because it's not a good business case, really. We are reinventing the playbook every year, really reinventing the wheel. We go to slightly different venues. We have a different experience. I mean, there's some core design principles that are always in place. One is we design for community and belonging. So we really want people to meet, and we create space for that. So it's not your typical conference where you listen to 50 PowerPoint presentations. In fact, we don't have screens at our conferences or at our events. We don't have PowerPoint at all. No name badges, as I mentioned earlier. Tangier was, in many ways, very special because it was the first time in Africa, the first time in Morocco, the first time in an Arab culture. And we completely fell in love with the city as a team. And I think so did our attendees. And Tangier is so interesting because it's a gateway city, right? So it's literally within eyesight of Spain. So it's it's the gateway to Europe. It's where the Atlantic and the Mediterranean meet. It's where different faiths, different influences, and of course its history as a colonialized international city with Spanish, French, British, Italian influences come to the fore. So if you want to look to a place where to explore a multidisciplinary, multilingual, multi-layered way of doing business, a new reality of business that has also a really interesting kind of spiritual connotation and a very strong literature tradition. A lot of writers went there for inspiration over the past few decades. You have to go to Tangier, and it also has a strong hedonistic spirit at the same time. It's a fascinating place, very mysterious, and we love being there. And 700 people attended, and I think it was just Matt Klein, who was one of the speakers. He's the head of foresight at Reddit, and he runs a publication called Zine. So he's also a trend researcher, futurist, and he was one of the people who spoke and shared something on LinkedIn. And he said, if you look for hope in this time of a poly crisis, you just have to just consider that 700 people are willing to travel to Tangier, which is not that easy, from the US and Europe and other parts of the world, and Africa, of course, and to meet there for 4 days with so much respect and openness to explore different ways of doing business in a very unusual setting. We had a palace, we met in a movie theater, in some small theaters, but mostly it was an outdoor palace, right? It was a garden that we were in the whole time, with a stage basically outdoors in a garden. So I think maybe more than anything else, AI, regenerative economics, feminism in its role in business and society, topics such as peacemaking as well in these very divided times, new realities, new consciousness, neuroscience, biology. I mean, so many topics we covered, but more than anything else, I feel like the main outcome and maybe the main intention of the event was to produce hope, to see there's a community of people who have influence, who have the desire to drive change, and they return home hopefully encouraged and invigorated and inspired, and rolling up their sleeves and having the words and the experiences and emotions and the community now to bring that change back to their organizations. So that's what I took away from it. And we're returning to Tangier next year because we feel like we've found a home there.
Very nice. Well, was there something personal for you, like a moment or two in those days that, I don't know, just really sparked something for you?
Oh, there were so many, Ezequiel. There were so many. I mean, I think I was very touched by the conversation that took place on stage between an Iranian and an Israeli peace activist who formed a nuclear disarmament activist duo. They've been working together for many years, but it's even more significant, of course, in light of recent events. And they were talking about their grassroots work and how they managed to. It's this old quote by Margaret Mead, I think, who said, "Don't underestimate the power. If there's two people wanting to change the world, don't underestimate." I'm really butchering it, but don't underestimate the power of more than two people who want to change the world and meet to do so. And they met at a grassroots level, and they're now in the floors of the UN and talk and with other organizations have had some real impact. And it was really interesting to hear about very nitty gritty how they had gone about their activist work and what kept them together. We also had Aziz Abu Zarah, a Palestinian peacemaker, whose brother was killed in one of the previous wars, and who is now working to really build bridges between Israelis and Palestinians, and talked about his work and what kept him going. So that was a really remarkable session. Another one was on the last day, on a somewhat different note, we did something that we did for the first time. We showed a film, actually, to close, if you will, close the event. It was a film by the Moroccan filmmaker Mariam Touzani, produced by her husband Nabil Ayouch. And the film is called The Blue Kaftan, and it describes essentially like a homosexual love in Morocco, where, as we know, that is a very controversial topic, and in fact, illegal. And the film was screened in Morocco, and it's a film about emotional intimacy. It's basically a triangle of love between a married couple, a woman and a man, and a young man that the man falls in love with and is coming out after many years of marriage. But it's the movie about a love between three people. And it showed Morocco, it showed traditions, conventions, and how they're also, and social transformation. But it also really showed love and true love and intimacy in the most beautiful ways. And I remember sitting in the Cinémathèque de Tanger, which is this legendary art house movie theater in Tanger, on the last day with maybe 300 or so other attendees, 700 were attending in total, and everybody crying in the end, in the last scene, like really weeping. And I think it was a mix of the movie touching them so deeply and bringing many of the threads that we had talked about home, but also it was just a release valve. It was an exhaustion also, because they were so stimulated and touched by the whole experience that it just had to sort of find its way out. And it was a beautiful moment. And I had not expected the movie or this experience to be so bonding in the end of an event that was full of stimulation and fireworks and spectacle and brilliant thoughts and on stage. But it was, in the end, I think it was this movie that brought it all home, speaking about the power of art.
Nice. So now I'd like to reorient back to the work that House of Beautiful Business does. And something I'm always curious to hear about is pattern recognition and like common challenges that people see. So first of all, at a kind of higher level of Zoom, what are some common client challenges that you see across organization in your present work?
Right now, it's organizations are really struggling with finding a new playbook. So I witnessed that the predominant paradigm, which has really been touted and shaped by Silicon Valley, right? It's like datafication of everything. If you have the right numbers, the right data, you can make the right decisions. It's this sort of solutionism that the writer Yevgeny Morozov branded. And as such, the idea that engineering can save the world, that efficiency gains and optimizing everything, including the most personal aspects of our lives, is the key to thriving and having a good life. That's really becoming obsolete, and it's been rendered obsolete, and people are skeptical about it, and it's no longer the one way of doing business, even though it's still quite influential. And now there's all these other ways of doing business that are popping up, whether it's more community-oriented ways of doing business, whether it's more radical degrowth approaches, it's cooperatives, right? It's platform cooperatives, it's regenerative, circular approaches to business. I mean, there's a whole array of alternative ways of doing business now. Big shifts also in the way I think talent is found and retained, and what talent and what people really need to do their best work and be inspired. All of that is undergoing profound shifts, and I think nobody has figured it out. So I think the one client need that we encounter all the time is, what the heck? What is going on? Help us make sense of this. Help us make sense of the world, the market that we're in, of society that we're in. What should we do? What should we do? Where are we headed? What is our role? What is the role of our brand, of our business in the future? And in many ways, that's what we're doing, right? So we either help them find that truth outside their organization by arranging a group of voices who shed light on societal or political or cultural trends through the lens of philosophy, the arts, the humanities, or science, or we help them find that truth within themselves, where they really take a very close look at what is inside them and what their needs are, their emotional, spiritual, somatic needs, and build it from there, and then connecting the two. So often organizations come to us and they want to understand the world, but then they translate that into a project brief that reads more like, we need help with a visioning process, right? The future of work, the future of mobility, the future of organization, the future of productivity. And we do this work either in the form of, we call it experiential thought leadership. So we basically produce thought leadership. We confront them with fresh ideas from emerging voices, but we convey these ideas to them in a form that is experiential, that is easier to digest, that's emotional, whether that is in the form of silent dinners or learning journeys or other sort of rituals and group interactions. So we either come into these organizations, to human resources, leadership development, employee experience, or it's through narrative development, marketing, product market fit, help us understand how what we do can resonate in this ever-changing world.
Yeah. So let me get your reaction to this. Something I've observed over time in reading, say, posts on social media, LinkedIn specifically, but also in working with projects with people directly, is that there's this belief, and I firmly believe it's just a belief, that the data will tell you what to do. And my position on that is that data are meaningless, and it takes people to imbue meaning in the data and make it meaningful. And so what you're speaking to this in some ways, at least for my interpretation. Tell me a little bit more. Do you have a reaction to my position, or some observations around how the emotional aspect of how people cling to data, or the beliefs that they have around data, and the either merits or perhaps erroneous beliefs that people may have around that?
Data is, I mean, when I wrote my book, The Business Romantic, it was very much meant as an antidote to a culture that is obsessed with data, right? I've made the argument that we're living in a new age of disenchantment because of datafication. It's actually marginalizing so many other sources of meaning and of truth and of reality that we have just shunned from the way we run our businesses, and in many ways also how we run our lives. Data, let's look at what it actually is. It's a language. It's a code. It is a way of codifying reality in a way that is presentable and accessible for the types of people who can read and speak that language. Data is, so people who have grown up with data or have some data literacy. It is not the truth. It's not reality. It's a snapshot. It's an approach. It's an iteration. It's a slice of it. It's translating parts of reality into a language that some of us understand, some don't. The same way painting is, or making a film, or writing a book, or doing yoga, or, I mean, there's so many other ways, I think, that help us access and make sense of reality. Data has just become the salient, prevalent language through which we make sense of the world, which is a real bummer. I'm not against data, and data is also, by the way, if you will, all of our intuition is a collection of experiences, right? A collection of moments, a collection of inputs that we then very quickly use to make decisions that we call intuitive, but it's also just data that we draw from. So it's data is everything and nothing. It's there, but there is so much more than data, right? So I think we should treasure it and use it, but always complement it with data, information, intelligence, insights, moments that are not data as in the quote unquote objectified sense that Silicon Valley and business has been using. And I do see the pendulum swing back. I think, I mean, it'll be really interesting to see with AI. AI is so interesting because it's, on the one hand, of course, the ultimate razor blade of data-driven capitalism, right? It's basically saying, okay, you lost. Like everybody who was against data and everything I just said, be that as it may, but you lost that battle because AI is essentially now taking all the past data that we shared on the internet and spitting it out again for us, creating new meaning. And it's the closest we've ever been to a completely datafied world. And yet, at the same time, AI is also interesting because it's opening up all these cracks and it's making us more cognizant of the way that we create meaning and create language. And it's creating a new language that is not just data, it's more than that. It's creating a new persona. It's creating a new consciousness, ultimately, if you will, maybe a new reality even. It's asking us, as one of our speakers said a few weeks ago, Niels von Quakebecker, a German organizational scholar, it's forcing us to ask better questions, beautiful questions, and not just to rely on the answers to questions that we had already drafted. So it's, yes, reductionist and forcing us into this monochromatic data world on the one hand, and at the same time also it's opening up a whole new world of coexistence with a whole new form of species that we have absolutely no handle on, that is deeply mysterious and mystical, and therefore also quite enriching. So it's those two forces, and we'll see where we land. You know where I stand. I mean, we have an initiative going on Beautiful AI, and Beautiful AI is, for us, is really that kind of AI that is enriching and mystical and expanding the playing field rather than giving us a set of of answers to questions that we had already conceived of.
Right. Yeah, I think another take I have on data is that it comes from there are questions underpinning data and there's assumptions underpinning data. And then not only that, but data so often people decide to capture what's easy to measure. But I mean, you have a daughter. You love your daughter. Show me data around that. You can't. You can show some behaviors, but the experience of loving somebody or certain transcendent experiences that we have, you can't really measure. And those happen to be the experiences that really make life worth living at the end of the day. And I was watching a video. I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Snowden. He has a company called Reinvent. So he specializes on applied complexity science. And in a short video he made, he was talking through some principles. And there's one principle that I think he borrowed the verbiage from a philosopher, where he acknowledges that we know more than we can say, and we can say more than we can write. And that really landed for me, because there's so much intuition and things that are just so intangible and not being able to capture. And actually, I mean, language does encode culture, but it's also just a pointer to experiences and sensations that we experience day to day. So I think thinking that the large language models are going to somehow capture that, I think it's erroneous. I think it's still a fairly limited way to capture the human experience versus what it's made of it, right? And right now it's the AI bubble, AI in everything, all the time, every day. I'm sick of it already. Anyway, but I mean, thank you for sharing your observations.
Why do you think data is so? Do you think it's because there's so much commercial power behind the data platforms that they've really kind of they promoted it so aggressively that there's no way for us to escape it? Or do you think it's because it is just such a great, compelling, simplified way of understanding? It's the lowest common denominator, and it's just really hard to resist.
I would agree with the latter. I'll tell you, I studied cultural anthropology in my undergrad, and I'm very curious about ethnobotany and folklore and myth and religion and traditional healing and so forth. And I just remember, and I went to an undergrad that was fairly difficult, and I remember speaking with friends in the hardcore math people, and it's a different psychology, that they like to land on a black and white answer, and there's one number, and that's what the world was for them. Being in the world of anthropology, you live in the gray and in a lot of nuance, and that would freak them out. They could not. Coming over to my world would just give them a lot of anxiety. Just like coming over to their world of the black and white, there's one answer, there's one way. That's deeply uncomfortable for me, because I don't see the world that way. So I think I agree with you that it's this very simplified, almost like security blanket, something that you can point to, but still misses the mark in many ways in as far as the human experience, as far as I'm concerned.
There's also, I mean, it's so true what you said about the experiences, right, that matter on our deathbed or that we hold in high esteem. They're all immeasurable. It's this beautiful word that actually most languages have, right? If something is very precious, it's immeasurable because it's infinite or it's elusive. And it's important to remind ourselves of that. And I wonder what an economy looks like that counts the immeasurable as well as valuable, right? I think that's where we want to go, and that's really what's beautiful. And I was just thinking, when you mentioned complexity theory, I just had a recent encounter with David Krakauer, who runs the Santa Fe, or is the director of the Santa Fe Institute, and a professor on complexity. And I gave a talk at a business conference, and I was making the case for new forms of intelligence, just as I did 20 minutes ago or so in this conversation. I said we need more spiritual intelligence, we need emotional intelligence, we need somatic intelligence, and artificial intelligence, and combine them all. And he raised his hand and said, why do you even call them intelligence? That is such an instrumentalist, that's such a compromise. That's already, in a way, like the language is already co-opted by corporates, intelligence. Like why does it have to be emotional intelligence? Why not just feelings? Why not just beauty? Why not just body? I mean, these are the metaphysical foundations of our society. So why do we try to force them through this gate of intelligence, right? That intelligence is in many ways sort of such glorified quality, right? We want to be intelligent, that we want an intelligent organization, when in fact, maybe we don't. Maybe we want a beautiful organization. We want an empathetic and emotional organization. We want a body aware organization. We want a imaginative organization, right? So it's time to at least complement this myopic obsession with intelligence with other qualities that are actually much older than intelligence is when we began to coin it and define it. Anyway, just as a side remark when you
Yeah.
mentioned
Yeah, I mean, just as a
complexity.
side rant to that is, I think I find it very unfortunate that the Silicon Valley people want to start embedding technology in our bodies, where I think that our bodies and our nervous system has so much more potential that we have barely explored and really maximized the potential of this vehicle that we have before introducing technology that I think in some ways thought as augmenting the vehicle, but I think it's really dulling the vehicle in some ways because we don't get to really fully exercise it. And are you familiar with Craig Foster, the filmmaker? He made My Octopus Teacher.
I haven't
On
seen
Netflix.
it, but I heard of it. Yeah.
Watch it. Well, he just published a book. It came out like a couple of days ago. I'm already three-quarters way through the audiobook. I highly recommend it for you. I think you would really like it based on what you've been sharing, because he talks about, well, history of filmmaking. He spent a lot of time with the San people in South Africa, and in that he acknowledges or touches of non-ordinary states of consciousness that they enter in various ways, in either through medicine people or in some forms of like ritual hunting, and in other ways of experiencing nature. That's just very interesting to reflect on the potentials of the human nervous system and how we can experience the world in different ways. And it's like rewilding our bodies in some ways. It's very inspiring. But yeah, having said that, I'd just like to come back to pattern recognition and now land. So we talked about what's challenging in organizations. I just like to land for a moment in the actual client team. So when you're doing work with them, have you noticed a pattern of where do they struggle in when you're doing this project, or where do you notice are the barriers, and what do you think might be underneath the beliefs or the psychology underneath those challenges and whatever behaviors that you're encountering?
There's fear. Fear is the biggest barrier.
Yeah.
It's always fear.
Right.
It's fear of losing face. It's fear
Mm-hmm.
of losing your job. It's fear of being socially stigmatized within an organization. Very often, and that's particularly true, I think, for high context cultures, such as the German one that I'm more familiar with because I grew up there. There's so much fear of losing face. And so often that fear is just a projection, right? It's not even real. There aren't actually consequences to the actions, but we think there will be consequences and we will be
Mm-hmm.
socially penalized. Hence, we don't do certain things. So that's one big obstacle. And at the same time, another pattern that I recognize is such a desire for belonging and real connection. That's why people come to our gatherings. That's
Mm-hmm.
when we coach executives from, say, Deloitte or other big organizations, Google, Porsche, others.
Mm-hmm.
We see this desire, right, to go deeper and to really connect on a human level and belong and feel psychologically safe and dream bigger in a way, right, within their role. And everybody wants it. Everybody wants to get out of their box and stretch their wings and reach new spheres in a way, right, and transform and become a new you, a new me. And often what is in the way is really is fear, or is an organizational culture or an organizational design that is the very manifestation of fear. Despite all the talk of flat hierarchies and holacracy and many other sort of organizational innovations of the past years and decades, I think there's still this really dominant Roman Empire-like top-down, very rigid organizational model, right? Even in our own organization, the House of Beautiful Business, we're prone to that as well, exactly the same way our clients are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing to do is always, I believe, to address the underlying power structures, make them explicit and really talk about them very openly. They're often formal, they're often informal, of course. To look at the networks and the flow of information and the relationships in organizations and really uncover why people go to work and why they do the work they do and why they relate to some people in their organization. And often these needs are deeply psychological and emotional and spiritual, and they're not functional. I always say when people come to the House of Beautiful Business that some people say, oh, so how many leads will I generate and why? What's in it for the business? Like, what will I bring back to my organization on Monday? And I just always say, I can answer that question, right? I can give you examples of projects that were born there and hires that were made and ideas and innovations that came out of our gathering. So I can give you sort of the business benefit catalog if you want that. But you will realize once you've attended that it's much bigger than that, right? And ultimately, nobody, not a so-called business person, I don't even know what that is, a business person, but business people attending our events, none of them is coming for business reasons. They're all coming because they're looking for something else, for friendship, for inspiration, for transformation, for purpose, for changing their lives, for all kinds of needs that are much deeper than the next deal. And I think that's the truth that is true. I mean, that's true for most organizations. I'm not saying, of course, CEOs and executives, of course, they have a commercial agenda, and we do as well. And of course, that's driving many of our actions. But I think also it's good for us overall to be more honest about this other set of needs that we pursue through business and that business allows us to pursue. And if we have that conversation, maybe there's less fear and maybe there's fewer barriers to creating business that is more life-centered, more beautiful.
It's interesting. Something I've learned in my own life is when I'm different, it invites other people to be different. And I think that's what we bring back to our business, aside from the leads and whatever else, is that. And I think especially for people in leadership positions or people who are looking after other teams, if you can just show up in a different state and a different way of being, that alone is what really opens doors. If you're looking to do something really meaningful and powerful. And I see you nodding. How has that shown up in your own life and things that you've observed?
Yeah, I'm laughing because just last night I went to an orchestra concert my daughter took part in. She's 14 in Atlanta, she lives, and she plays the cello, and it was the last orchestra concert that they performed at school for the conductor, for the teacher who's leaving the school. And I was just sitting there listening to, I mean, they performed at an amazing level, but that wasn't the point. It was also sometimes not a bit dissonant and not so great, the 7th and 8th graders. But this woman, this teacher, the conductor, I mean, the way she's been holding the space for these kids and how she introduced each piece, it was just such a demonstration of leadership. She was so real, so genuine, and I've seen her now a few times, and I was really moved by that. And then it was her last concert. She's leaving the school, and then in the end, there were lots of tears and gifts were made. And then she at some point just basically said one more thing after all the sort of sad farewell remarks, and she said, all of those little chairs that you're sitting on, these foldable chairs to your parents, you have to fold them now and bring them all back into the school. There were hundreds of them. And then she started cracking up and laughing and said, I've always wanted to say this. And then you have to, and it was such a trivial, mundane thing, these logistics. And it was so her that it was such a humble gesture that she didn't like talk about herself that much, but just about, let's close this last concert also perfectly. And we're all in this together. And I don't know, I was just thinking about her as an example of really beautiful leadership. Leadership is always, I feel like, or character in leadership always, it shines in the dark, right? It's exactly what you put on and show when nobody's watching or not watching closely. It's the teacher, conductor in a school where the world public's not watching, but maybe 500 parents are, right? But it's that leadership consistently that I find really amazing. And we don't give and we should, sort of create more platforms for maybe sharing these stories as well.
You know, well, on this topic, this just makes me think of here in Miami Beach, there is the New World Symphony, which is a education institution for very talented musicians in the world of classical music. And so they come there like after their undergrad to do like a postgrad type of thing before they go off into professional life. And the skill level of these people is just extraordinary, right? They're like best of the best. And I have a good friend who works there, and he's told me about times when they bring Yoma to coach these people. And Yoma, he's just really concentrates on the emotions. So he's like, yeah, you have technique. Yeah, that's fine. Whatever. And he really dials in on the emotion and connecting with audiences. And it's very beautiful. So I'm aspiring to have Yo-Yo on this podcast one day. But if you look around on YouTube, look at his interviews, he's just so human. But it also touches on this whole idea of the way of being. So yes, you have the technique, fine. But it's the way of being and what you're projecting to other people that actually creates that connection and makes a huge difference. So I don't know. It's wonderful that your daughter is doing that. Have her watch some Yoma interviews. He's sort of like really wonderful person. Great. So I think you were addressing the aspects of the work that do connect and click with people and like something in people. What's a way or something that you do like early on to help overcome the fear? So we talked about kind of making the leadership structures explicit and so on. I think that's kind of to partially help people start to like process the fear and maybe get more grounded. But what have you found has been very helpful for you in like opening people up, like that first movement of opening? Is there something that you do with some consistency, or I don't know, what's a lesson learned from you?
Discomfort or even embarrassment is always very helpful. We don't want to embarrass people or push them too hard into zones of discomfort, but it's more about us as the facilitators than modeling that. So for example, at this last gathering that we held in Tangier, we kicked off the opening reception with a flash mob that connected everybody dancing with each other. But then the three hosts, my co-founder Till, Hane, our Moroccan co-host, and I, we basically sang Just the Two of Us by Bill Withers in a pretty horrible version. It was not great, to be honest, and there was feedback, and it was not meant to be great. But then someone came to me afterwards and said, this was so good that you did it, because from the first moment on you set the tone. It's not about perfection. You know, be somebody else, be daring, you know, do what you want to do, even if it's not great, if it's not perfect, if it's not super slick. So that really helps when we do online sessions or engagements with clients in person. We have a musical director actually on staff, Mark Underwood, a Mexican artist, musician, composer who lives in Barcelona. So we often kick off engagements with music or have musical interludes, because it really helps you engage with each other and with the topic very differently than a purely intellectually word-driven way of engaging. We often also use silence. So again, I think the common theme here is vulnerability or intimacy. We kick off projects with silent dinners where 20 executives eat silently and dine silently and sit around the table and feel very awkward at first, but then appreciate this tenderness that comes from connecting without words, from omitting words, and just sort of feeling and seeing each other quite truly. We do silent eye gazing exercises with one of our community members, Esther Blasquez Blanco, a Spanish facilitator and coach, is using eye gazing, for example, with insurance companies such as Aegeas and others to help them create a culture of trust. So it's always, I think at the beginning you have license to play and to create a disruptive, gently discomforting, embarrassing, vulnerable moment. But the key thing is, of course, that you as the facilitators and you as the party coming to the table, that we model it ourselves, right? We can't just demand it. We have to actually make the first step. And then often people are like, oh, okay, let's play. Okay, this is interesting, right? This allows me to be different. And that's always appreciated. That's always appreciated, these spaces, because people want to see, they want to bring out a different version of themselves, of the true version of themselves, and we allow them to do so. What is much harder, by the way, than the opening, in a way, we can design and devise, and it's maybe not the hardest part, actually, cracking people open or creating this initial. What is much, much harder, in my experience, is the reintegration. Right? So you get people out of their common space and their day-to-day habits somewhat easily, right? They're very willing to go there if you model it right. but it's very hard to sustain it and to reintegrate and come back from an experience like this and then go back to your organization and not to feel this letdown, this deflation. And I would have to lie if I told you that we had figured out how to do that. I mean, we have some reintegration techniques. We work with somatic coaches. We sometimes keep coaching people individually, but it's really hard.
Well, I think it's like going to the gym. You have to keep on doing it because we're like our bodies are constantly battling gravity, right? So I think that's the metaphor is you have to exercise and keep that build up the strength to keep battling the gravity of the other stuff that can weigh us down. Yeah, so that's a big act of will. Tim, so what do you think are just 2 or 3 skills that you think are really important to cultivate, to learn, or cultivate or learn to shape a more humane future for business and society? What were top 2, 3 things that come to mind?
The ability to dream big, to create fantasy worlds, to not confuse with reality or what's possible with what you see and what we measure and what we discern with functional tools. So it's really that. It's an artistic, unbounded imagination that we have as children, and that, as Sir Ken Robinson famously pointed out in his Dead Dog, that we are basically, it's kind of trained out of us, right, in many of our current school methodologies, unfortunately. That's one. The second one is empathy. I think it's this idea that there's always another world, that there's always another perspective, that there's always another truth. And this is also always when I find it's so important to speak 2 languages. It can be the language of software and the language of literature. It can be English and Turkish. It can be French and German. It can be whatnot. But I think if it's 2 languages, it doesn't matter what it is, but I think if you speak another language, figuratively or metaphorically, you know that there's always another truth. There's another sense of humor. There's another way of looking at things. And I think that is so important as we are struggling to coexist, and now also coexist with AI and other sort of emerging forms of being. And the third one maybe is, it's a good question. I think it's conviction, I would say. It's really interesting. There is a really beautiful quote by the legendary pianist Glenn Gould, whose interpretation of the Goldberg Variations by Johann Sebastian Bach is part of the Golden Record, right? That is on part of the Voyager sound as a calling card for extraterrestrial life or alien life. And Glenn Gould once said of his interpretation, not of Bach, but of Beethoven's Moonshine Serenade, that it wasn't the most convincing version, but it was the most convinced. And that line really struck with me. So what that means for me is that it's not about convincing someone or persuading all the time, but that true integrity comes when you do something because you are not trying to convince somebody else, but when you are convinced of it. When you feel like this is something that I've worked on and earned the relationship to an object, to a piece of art, to an idea, that I'm convinced of it because I did everything I could possibly do to relate to it and now present it to the world. Then you are convinced, right? Your values match sort of the relationship you have to people, ideas, and things. I think that's great. I think conviction is something really beautiful. And at the same time, also knowing that, and this is maybe the fourth, humility, that your conviction is always flawed. It can always be wrong. But nobody benefits from us doing things without conviction. Like a conviction is like a dot on a pointillistic painting, right? It adds up to a big picture. If everybody adds their conviction to it, then actually we have a really good, balanced, maybe sense of reality. But it doesn't help if it's a haphazard, tentative, coy, wavering point of view or perspective or piece of art. So, and I don't know how to learn that or teach that. I don't know if I have it, but I'm trying to aspire to it. And I know that I'm very happy with my work when it's the most convinced.
Yeah. Well, Tim, we're going to jump in the time machine now and do a little bit of a retrospective on your career and some lessons learned. So we're going to wind the time machine back to the mid 90s. And about 30 years ago or so, you were a musician with a band and a record deal. And I'm just curious to poke at this. Are there lessons you learned from playing professionally in front of live audiences that influence how you work today?
Oh yeah, for sure. So, oh God, the band was called Migraine, and it was anything but migraine heavy or inducing because it was very mellow, soft jazz, chansonesque music. I sang and played the guitar and wrote some of the songs. We recorded 2 albums. I learned a lot about editing and creating when we recorded. In particular, I
Mm,
loved these 2, 3, 4 weeks that we had in the studio, track over track, finessing a track, adding another harmony vocal, less is more, taking things out, right? Like the sculpting of art or of a creation, like a product, like a festival, like a client project. I think so much that I've learned, and still I'm not so bad at it. It sounds so pretentious, but I'm still not great at it. There's still too much I do.
mm,
Brian, the musician, once said, right, the thing is, what people don't understand is the more tracks you take away, the more expensive the sound, rather than the opposite.
mm,
And I think we think by adding things, right, we it's more expansive and it's richer, but quite the opposite. So this is what the recording taught me. And then live performances, oh my
mm.
God, we had some amazing concerts and some absolutely horrible, really completely failed concerts. And
Yeah.
I think what I learned is listening to each other. When you play with other musicians, you learn a lot about collaboration and really tuning into somebody else's rhythm and their body and their way of feeling and expressing themselves and looking like the cues. Like if business teams actually operated like a band, oh my
Mm,
God, the results would be so much better. You
yeah.
know, it's I think there's so much listening and so much attention, and particularly in jazz and subtle cues and improvisation and so much play.
Mhm.
There's so much to learn. And I think the other thing you learn when you perform live, I did some street music as well in the south of France, I remember, is you are confronted very much with this notion of rejection. Right, so you put
Mm,
yourself out there, and the rejection is pretty imminent. I
mm,
mean, people walk out of a small club or a bar,
mm,
or there's lots of noise, and they don't pay attention to you. You have to really earn the crowd's attention. Sometimes we managed to do so, other times we
mm,
didn't. But I think you
mm,
you learn that on stage you cannot hide. Maybe you can't hide at all in life, and there's always rejection. And how we deal with rejection, I think, in many ways, is a formative. I think it makes or breaks us. I think I would say it's something we don't talk about much, rejection, but it's such a crucial experience of life.
yeah. Well, then a few years after that, you went on to found you founded and ran a music publishing business. So, what were your biggest takeaways from learning to operate the business side of the music industry?
That passion alone doesn't make a good business.
Mm,
Not the words you would expect from a business romantic, but it's very true. I had all these high flying dreams, and I thought, oh, let's. And I was interested in this, what was then called the artist and repertoire, the A&R process of labels, like finding talent, growing talent. And with our publishing company, we wanted to be front end of that channel and really identify talent and then sell it or represent it to the record companies, but it just didn't scale. And I think also maybe I learned a lot also about the right working with the right people. So my co-founder, then it just didn't work out. I think one thing I've learned is that when I was younger, I think I maybe saw more value in complementary personalities. I thought I want someone who's not like me,
mhm,
and then it's going to be great, and it's going to be this magical mix. And I think the older I get and the more I've learned from these experiences, the more I think, no, quite the opposite. I think while diversity is really important, cognitive, emotional diversity for groups of people, for teams, I think when it comes to two co founders, I think it's actually, you really need to think alike. There needs to be a lot of emotional overlap. And this is why actually with my co-founder with the House of Beautiful Business, Till, we grew up in a similar part of Germany. Our biographies are very similar. We worked together at Frog
mhm,
Design for a while in Silicon Valley,
mm,
and we're also best friends.
mhm, mhm.
And it's not coincidental. So I think that's maybe the main lesson I learned from the publishing episode,
Yeah.
which was, yeah, not a commercial highlight for me,
Mm.
to
Well,
say the least.
so I'd like to do a pass at this. So, in I think I reflect quite often around just the whole concept of value and value creation. And an example that's very clear that I use now and then is it's just so common to see instances where a recording artist who actually creates value and brings people to venues, etc., are sometimes the last person to prosper from their work. And I think that's something that you could probably generalize to creative industries. I'm just curious about how did your experience in the music industry did it shape or change or deepen your understanding of value creation and value exchange?
Yeah, I mean, I was really only on the fringes of the music industry, so I
Mm-hmm.
can't really say that I understand that industry particularly well, but I was very
Mm-hmm.
interested in it. And I was part of it at the time in the 90s, end of 90s, when the model was so radically different from what it is today. So there weren't any 360-degree deals.
Yeah.
There wasn't social media. Artists building their own audience by themselves wasn't a thing as much as it is now, right? It was all very much the monopoly and the the gatekeeping of the labels. That has drastically changed. But I think what I've learned is, I mean, maybe three things: grit, persistence. If a talent is really exceptional, and it is combined with persistence, a lot of it will then eventually be heard and find some form of resonance. I really am convinced of that. But you have to be very, really persistent and very gritty and go the extra mile all the time. It's a lot of hardship. The other thing I've learned is just that it's not that I've figured it out, the formula, but I've learned maybe what resonates.
Okay.
And I'm very interested in that. I'm physically suffering when I sit in a session that I help curate and I can feel the attention drop
Mm.
and I can feel everything. And it bothers me so much.
Mm.
Although it's very human, of course, that people
Mm-hmm.
also tune out. But like, I'm very interested in how can I create something, how can I create a song or an album or a session or a play that really captivates someone's attention and consistently. That's also something that I struggled with or that I was trying to learn from working with musicians and observing their work. And then I think the third thing that I've learned is just branding and marketing and having a good narrative and a good name and a good story and being really being very different. I think what I always find interesting is my friend Priya Parker, who is a conflict facilitator and wrote the book The Art of Gathering, once said to me, you can't be, you have to be urban or rural, but you can't be suburban when you are creating something, when you are a brand. Like you can't be too much middle of the road in the middle of everything. So either be very fully mainstream and conformist and easy and convenient, or you have to be radically different. You have to do your complete different, unorthodox thing. That explains the success of acts like Bon Iver and others.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's also Taylor Swift, who's musically not necessarily revolutionizing the music history, but is just a super clever and incredibly talented, of course,
Mm-hmm.
singer, songwriter, performer, artist, right? Who sort of created a whole business and brand, and but basically going the opposite way and actually staying very firmly within mainstream.
So now in the mid 2000s, you started working at Frog Design. So can you tell us what is Frog Design and what were your most valuable takeaways from your role as chief marketing officer there?
Frog Design was founded by a German industrial designer, Hartmut Esslinger, I believe, in the 70s. And he and Frog Design then rose to fame because they worked very closely long before my time there with Steve Jobs and Apple, and really helping create this Snow White design language that shaped the first Apple products, and then went on to work for many tech brands and many tech pioneers, and it became one of these household design brands. Then also really becoming part of this design thinking trend that IDEO helped lead, which was Frog's main competitor. It was a great time. I worked in Palo Alto. I had worked for a software company before when I moved to the Bay Area, and then basically I was in Palo Alto and in San Francisco, where Fork had two offices there, and then also worldwide offices. And I don't know, it was very interesting for me to see the creativity at scale. How do you organize and serialize creativity? And Frog was a company that prided itself with being very irreverent, very original, really shaking up the industry and getting people to think differently. And it really did to some degree. But of course, the business was only viable because there was also a lot of serialization and formalization of efforts, right, and certain methodologies that were in play. So I learned on the one hand, I witnessed really relentless, wild creativity. Certainly also a lot of egos. It was a very romantic, wild company in many ways. But at the same time, I also learned that I think this is maybe true for the design industry overall. If you're really creative, don't join one of these companies. If you have a very vivid artistic imagination, or you're really very creative and you have a very strong sort of idiosyncratic creativity, maybe these places where at the end of the day you end up with cookie cutter, or no, cookie cutter is too negative of a word, but some like formalized forms of creating, it might be frustrating ultimately for you to stay there, right? Because it is a machine. And that was maybe my main observation. But I'm super grateful. I mean, this was my professional coming of age, and I had a wonderful boss, Doreen Lorenzo, and I learned so much. I mean, for me, it was like looking over the shoulders of giants, if you will. And all these people working with amazing companies. We worked with Netflix very early on, other companies that really then became very big and very influential. It was a really wonderful time.
Yeah. Well, right at the tail end of that, you wrote this book, The Business Romantic. Give everything, quantify nothing, and create something greater than yourself. What motivated you to write that book?
I was still working at Frog Design at the time, and I had begun, because of the work that I did as chief marketing officer, I was in touch with the World Economic Forum, and we became partner of TED, the Big Ideas Festival. We went to South by Southwest, a conference in Austin. So I was in touch with a lot of ideas and thought leaders, and the way we ran our marketing was very thought leadership driven. So expressing ideas and distributing ideas. So I began to write myself, and I was very kind of immersed in that world and met a lot of interesting people. And yeah, I just began to write and then realized that what I wrote, first about marketing and branding, very kind of close to home, that it resonated and people read it, and then that it actually gave me a lot of satisfaction and intellectually. And then I think the other seminal episode was when Frog was preparing an IPO, and I worked very closely with the parent company, which was an IT outsourcing company, and private equity, KKR, who were the owners on an IPO. I just learned a lot about the logic of investors and especially private equity, and it really shocked me to the core. These very smart, number crunching guys who were really the barbarians at the gate, right? To quote the famous book about private equity and about KKR. In fact, one of the main people portrayed in the book was also on the board of the parent company. I worked with them. And I was just shocked by their lack of appreciating culture and value, and sort of just looking at the bottom line in such a one-dimensional way that it actually destroyed value, even for them
Yeah.
by their standards. And looking at the politics and the processes that I was privy to, it just shocked me, and it destroyed so much, and it really threatened, I think, this very precious, delicate culture of frog design at the time. And I was part of these tensions. So I think this really was the spark for me to write a book about my truth and saying we need a different way. There needs to be something else. And I, having been entrenched in French art house movies and German philosophy when I grew up in Europe and in Germany, I became so homesick for that in Silicon Valley. And maybe the book was an attempt, it was a return home long before I then eventually moved home to Europe physically. And I think at the time, I think it was a bit ahead of the time. I remember that people were saying, oh, this book is about purpose, right? And I said, no, it's about romanticism. That's a much more uncomfortable term. And now I feel it came out in 2015. It's much more embraced, or many of the things that I wrote about in the book are now much more part of, not because of my doing or this book in particular, but just because the zeitgeist overall shifted.
Yeah.
They're now much more part of sort of business mainstream than they were in 2015.
Right. Yeah, I can tell when a brand is acquired by a private equity company, within about a couple of years later, you start to see the brand and the service and the quality of things just kind of start to lose whatever it is that I liked about the brand. And then regrettably, I have to move on to something else. Anyway, that said, looking back at your book now, so it's been 9 years, has your thinking about anything that you wrote changed or evolved in some significant way?
Yeah, I think yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so many things have changed. I think I would probably be more radical now. So I
Mm-hmm.
was looking
Mm-hmm.
at the dynamics of business and the process of business. I was trying to infuse them with emotions and some of the humanistic, sentimental education parts, pieces that I described in the book. But it was a very humanistic book, very humanities based. And I think my thinking has evolved in such that it's no longer human centered, it is life centered, as we elaborated on earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a bit broader and maybe also more radical. I think I'm more interested in politics and the structural limits of business than I am necessarily in the interplay or in the team interplay, team interpersonal relationships. So yeah, I find maybe business per se a little bit less interesting for me as an arena.
Mm-hmm.
So the next book that I'm writing is about curation as our superpower, and it is rooted in business because that's my home turf, and of
Mm-hmm.
course that's what I do with the House of Beautiful Business. But I increasingly believe that the future of business is outside of business, and that in fact the future of business is not even the point. It's the future of everything, right?
Yeah.
It's I'm more interested in ideas per se or humans
Mm-hmm.
and the species, but not so much how do we improve business. I think
Mm-hmm.
the Business Romantic was a business book, or it was published by a imprint publisher, but it wasn't really a business book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think now maybe I have more inclination to write a book that is not even a business book to
Mm-hmm.
begin with, or
Yeah.
doesn't even pretend to be a business book.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of that, the name of this project is Making Business Art, the other MBA, as I like to call it. What comes up for you when you hear that phrase?
I mean, yes and yes. So we were actually toying with the idea of an MBA as well at some point at the
Mm-hmm.
House of Beautiful Business, like a Master of Business Arts, we called it. And art has always been one core tenet of the House of Beautiful Business. We've tried not to make it an ingredient that is decorative, but actually a really essential part of doing business. So
Mm-hmm.
I remember we held sessions on melancholy and blockchain, or looking at the portrait by Dürer on melancholy, and so we work with dancers and choreographers. We worked with painters and musicians, of course. I mentioned earlier we have a musical director, so it's very integral to what we do. I think of Andy Warhol's quote, right? Every great business is art, and I think my worry is just that art is co-opted, right? I think that's
Mm-hmm.
always the danger, of course, whether that is marketing in the channels of Nike and other brands,
Yeah.
or it's internally for the sake of productivity gains and efficiency gains and more productive workforces. Now we have a little bit of art in there, right? So the
Yeah.
well-being is enhanced and people feel good about their work. When in fact, art is a way of seeing the world. It's maybe the best way of seeing the world. It's the most comprehensive, richest, most intuitive, most informed way for us humans to see the world, whether that is through novels or movies or other genres, much more so than business. So I would say it's making business more like art. Probably yes. I mean, yes, but making business better through art, not so sure.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that's the difference or where I would draw the line.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the exploration is exploring ways to make business more meaningful and enchanting for ourselves and the people we serve, and then everything that needs to happen for that to be the case.
Mm.
And I'm just curious, what do you find most meaningful and enchanting in your own work?
Writing. I think the
Mm-hmm.
truth is ultimately always on paper or on a Word doc or in a book. I can't think of anything that I've done that it has not started with words. Whether and if it's ultimately a gathering or a product or a service, but it's always about the words and it's the language and it's the
Mm-hmm.
narrative that starts with a word. And I'm a very literal person in the sense that I words are really important for me, and I'm really fascinated by words. So I like writing, and it gives me a lot of enchantment and joy. But at the same time, I also love concepts come to fruition. Maybe the biggest joy that I have is the anticipation. So I love being backstage before the curtain opens for the first time and not knowing how an audience responds. I'm less interested in the downstream. So when the show is on the road and it's a matter of execution, and I have the absolute greatest respect for my colleagues and people I know and peers who do that so well, and without them, everything would be nothing. But personally, I'm very much on the front, and I love the inspiration part of it, the curation part of it, and then honing everything to a point where the curtain opens, and then I can also just go home, seeing the first reaction, and I just can go home, basically.
Yeah. All right, Tim. Well, we've reached the end of our conversation. I'd like to just do a quick lightning round and then open up space for you to share what you have going on. So you ready for lightning round?
Ready.
All right. So here's a good one for you. What is a song or band that you must play during a solo road trip?
Van Morrison's album, Astral Weeks.
Excellent. What's the last piece of media that you loved? That could be a book, a movie, a podcast, or anything else.
I really enjoy listening to the Ezra Klein show, the New York Times podcast, and I was just listening to a conversation about editing, actually, and how artists edit, and I forgot the name of the guest, but it was really fascinating. In general, I really like listening to Ezra Klein. I think he's a wonderful interviewer and journalist.
I'm going to look that up. What is something that inspires you?
My daughter, and trying to decipher the many ways in which she is, trying to decode her.
The mystery.
Just this perennial mystery. And I think I'm a neophilist. I think a neophile, you say. I really like I love going to new places and doing things for the first time. I find that very inspiring. Learning a new language or going to a new city, new places, new people. I find that the more foreign I am, the more I'm inspired.
And last question is, what do you want to see more of in the world?
It's funny, I'm tempted to say beauty, but then I'm thinking, is that really true? Or do we compromise the value of beauty if it's become so ubiquitous? So do we need more beauty or just beauty in the right places? I want to see more beauty in the right places.
I'll take that. That's excellent. Well, Tim, thank you so much for being a guest today. Can you tell people what do you have going on, why they should look you up, and where they can find you?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Ezequiel. It was a really very thought-provoking conversation for me. Look us up. I mean, definitely come and check out the House of Beautiful Business, www.houseofbeautifulbusiness.com. Work with us, bring the house to your organization. If you want to learn about what a future of business might look like, you want to experience it, I think we're the place to go. Come join us for our next gathering, which will take place again in Tangier next May, 14th to 18th, 2025. Wonderful city, wonderful community, wonderful gathering. Come join us. And then in the meantime, of course, I would love to just connect and learn. And so if you feel like you want to contribute, you have a point of view, you want to be part of our community, just reach out through the usual channels.
Great. And then the house does do meetups in New York periodically during the year, right?
Right. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. So we're actually planning an event on September 20th, which is during the United Nations General Assembly Week, when everybody is in New York. And we will do this with the Acosta Institute. It's an institute focused on healing-centered education and leadership. It'll take place in New York. And the focus of this event will be to create a poly opportunity map in response to the poly crisis. And if that's something that you're passionate about, then watch that space. I think we'll announce it soon in more details, and we'd love for you to join.
Excellent. Tim, thank you so much for being a guest today. As I like to say now and then, is we can always make more money, but we cannot make more time. So thank you so much for your valuable time today.
Thanks so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.